Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. And I hope everybody's staying safe at home, everybody's healthy. Today, we are presenting to you a really vital topic. It's the post COVID 19 global supply chain, deglobalized or decoupled. My name is Melody Benaboo, and I am the Regional Sales Manager for NexInfo Solutions. And just a little bit of our little housekeeping here before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them on the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel on the right, and we will address those questions at the end of the presentation. Let me begin with an introduction of our presenter. I introduced myself to you. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Nick Valles. It's an honor to have him as our special guest presenter today. Nick has a very significant background, and we start with giving you, he's the Executive Director and Co-founder of Center for Global Supply Chain Management at USC Marshall. Big educator, thought leader, author, keynote speaker, and advisor to leaders in the world of supply chain practice and policy. In 2018, Dr. Valles was bestowed the Supply Chain Leader Award of Excellence by Apex. Also a founder, Supply Chain Professionals Without Borders. Also a contributor, Supply Chain Management Review, NPR, KCRW, CBS News, The Economist, and the LA Business Journal. Lastly, he is also a member of the U.S. Department of Commerce Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness. Very impressive. Now, without further ado, I'd like to spend our time with our session. So again, if you have any questions, please use the GoToWebinar panel on your right side, and we will address those questions at the end of our session, at the end of the presentation. Again, without further ado, we will turn this time over to Nick. Nick. Hello, Nick. I'm turning it over to you. Maybe you're on mute.
Indeed, I was on the mute. Thank you, Melody. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to this webinar. It is my pleasure to sort of talk about this whole topic about the deglobalization versus decoupling. So recently, in our last several months, I've had a chance to write sort of an extensive blog. I did the two-part blog on exploring how US-China trade war actually began and what was it all about. And the perspective of that blog was basically to share that this is no longer a Cold War about sizing up the power, military mights, or the muscles, but rather it was the dominance of supply chain. And the root cause of this trade war that we started really goes back even further, all the way to 2010, 2011, when the academics, both in US and Europe, we started to sort of look at what we call the China shock. And so one has to understand, what is this China shock, right? And it was actually sort of an influence that in about 20, 25 years, that China was able to commensurate and create sort of a cloud and control, and in some cases even dominate the end-to-end supply chain. And so if you keep that as a backdrop of where this thing started, we can then contextualize how this whole decoupling and deglobalization will come into play. So for context, let's take a quick look at it, right? How China became a significant player, especially when we talk about the supply chain. So the 1990s reforms subsequently boosted by entry into the WTO in 2001, it really helped China expand its manufacturing export from what used to be close to 6% to almost 18% in 2012, right? And then you look at similar time period for US, we decreased by 50% from 18% to 9%, right? So this really played a huge role in building up this China shock conversation. Let me just make sure. So if you think about China became in 2018, if we just step back, the biggest goods exporter, close to about $2.5 trillion. We were second at about $1.7 trillion, right? You look at the size of the Chinese economy. In every single domain, China really sort of took the leadership position. And when we start to look at this, we have to sort of decouple an understanding, not only building the manufacturing hub, but then it really started to expand its influence beyond just the trade, beyond just the manufacturing. And that is a key point here that we have to remember. So if we look at the trade and then the trade war leading up to that, right? It is certainly, we can compare between EU, Japan, China, East Asia, which includes Japan and China, and us, the US, right? There is clear evidence that the Chinese influence in a trade had become substantial to the point that it started to become the political narratives in both the EU and North America. So it started this bubbling and surfacing about how this concentric circle of Chinese manufacturing can spread outside just the trade. So if we look at this even further, the export in terms of the billions, China really stood out. So it's China, US, and then Germany. And then you can see the cluster of a lot of other countries just bunched in a very small quadrant in the left. So it started to become apparent that it is going to be sort of a positioning and influence from an ambition of starting out with the manufacturing hub to then going outside of that influence to controlling the trade policies, and then getting into really controlling what I would consider even bigger issues that came up, which is controlling the supply chain. So for those of you who are familiar with the BRI, Belt and Road Initiatives, also known as OBOR, it was clear that China just didn't want to supply the manufacturing goods and services, but they really wanted to sort of build the supply chain network. And that supply chain network, basically, China really wanted to control the land, the waterways, the airways, and now the last piece, which is the digital. And this created a humongous friction across the political spectrum. So when we start to think about the supply chain dominance, it really started to play in that China no longer is now the manufacturing hub. China no longer controls most of the nodes within the supply chain, or has at least greater influence within those supply chain nodes. But they have actually invested over $1.5 trillion into building the BRI, what we call the Belt and Road Initiative, linking across the country from Asia into the Europe, into the Middle East, and tying all of the key supply chain networks. Further, China took the leadership position in the 5G infrastructure equipment, right? So if you think about Huawei and ZTE, outside of those two large Chinese companies, Ericsson and Nokia were the only two were left playing into the space of 5G. And certainly the US, we didn't have any representation in terms of getting into the 5G. Now, this point is very important because if you think about going from 2G to the 3G, 3G to the 4G, what enabled us to truly drive the transformation in emerging technologies, especially within the supply chain? 5G was even incredibly evolutionary in terms of the infrastructure. And China really invested, built a core competency, and started to spread out their wings towards what I call the digital infrastructure on top of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which already had the physical infrastructure. So if you put all of these pieces together, it certainly leads to why do we have this decoupling conversation, right? So COVID-19 is just a catalyst. So we have to keep this in a perspective. The pre-COVID-19, we seen the US-China trade war was full-blown, right? We talked about Trump administration taking a position in terms of understanding that why certain trade policies were not such advantageous in not only for the North American standpoint, but in a Western democracy standpoint. So it truly started to have this sort of a conversation about decoupling. And we can actually bifurcate that conversation now to say this decoupling concept. So let me define what I mean by decoupling. So the operational definition of deglobalization and decoupling is as follows. When conversation starts to build up about deglobalization, which if you have read the recent article by many of the published journals, they're talking about deglobalization. So operational definition for deglobalization would be that, hey, we are going to now not really trade across the borders. We will pretty much become self-sufficient, and we will create the tendency to manufacture everything locally, consume locally, and sort of live in a what I call so-called bubble. I do not subscribe to that at all. Decoupling, an operational definition I would lay out, is that we would have the supply chain network sort of decoupled from a China-centric view to much more customer-centric view by region, by continent, and have those independent networks interconnected between the regions and continent for interdependency. So we will have sort of this decoupled view of the global supply chain than deglobalized view. The way I want to envision this is, where does this conversation of deglobalization and decoupling comes from? And why do I lean towards the decoupling rather than deglobalization? So I want to put a placeholder for that thought and come back to that so that we can bridge that conversation with deglobalization versus decoupling, right? So if you think about US, our economic growth of 6.1% over last several years was actually linked somewhat, especially in the mid to upper tier manufacturing, away from China. So when this trade war started to happen, the pivoting of supply chain was already in works. We saw the Vietnam. US bound exports surged to 36% last July. Mexico and Canada became our top number 1 and 2 trading partner, respectively. So we already started to see the initial movement towards the decoupling. And then COVID-19 came, right? So anytime we go back to the history, there is always a catalyst that sort of accelerates the evolutionary curve. So if you think about previous major events, right, from the Spanish flu to the Black Swine event to other major pandemics that we have seen that those became the catalyst, and each of those previously encountered pandemic led to somewhat the deglobalization. However, we are in a different phase at this time. So January through now, if you look at it, we have obviously an ample evidence that COVID-19 has created a global disruption. It is certainly evident that we have seen a foreshock, continued shock, and we're likely to see sort of prolonged aftershocks of COVID-19. As the economy opens up for the rest of the world, including ours, we're likely to see some lingering effect of COVID-19. So we have to be very cognizant that this downward lingering effect, having 38 million plus people already filed for unemployment, will create humongous policy decisions that would reshape how the supply chain networks are going to look like. We are seeing some initial conversation about certain commodity, certain verticals, certain disciplines, such as biosciences, pharmaceuticals, some essential commodities within even the PPEs categories. The conversation is percolating that those will be made locally. Now that may actually give some indication to come to conclusion that, hey, that implies that we will start to make everything locally. And that may lead to a lot of the sentiment in industry to say it is a deglobalization and it is not a decoupling. And for those folks that they are bent over on this issue of deglobalization, because that's an easier conversation, we can actually look at the previous history and succumb to the emotions of our habits of the past. We can succumb to our limited view of supply chain and think that redesigning supply chain, pivoting out of China-centric supply chain network is probably the tougher than simply just packing our bags and coming home. I strongly believe that is not going to be the case. And I will continue to build on to that thought and hypothesis because what we have seen that overall impact of COVID-19, it is certainly unclear, right? We know one thing is clear, which is economic implications going to be bigger than ever. And then the cure is going to have far-reaching implication on the global economy. Some negatives, but mostly and hopefully positive. So how do I come to this supporting of my hypothesis that it is decoupling and not deglobalization? So as I sort of planted for you the scenario of the past, so we have to look at the history. So the past, every event, we talked about it, led us to deglobalization. But the future, what I'm proposing, is the decoupling is the best case scenario. Instead of having these interconnected supply chains and nodes, which, by the way, we made conscious decision. This conversation should not surprise anybody in our world to say, why did we get here? How did we get here? And why are we caught with the flat foot? This has been going on for over the last 25 years, that we did not really care about the resiliency, mitigation strategy, or any geopolitical tension that can potentially disrupt the supply chain. And the reason being was that we were simply focused on the cost. As long as I can get cheaper, better, faster, I will design, execute, and completely become dependable to those supply chain networks. So while we're doing this, I have to really emphasize the byproduct of last 30 years of globalization. We have created the largest segment of our population, over 1.6 billion people, to move from extreme poverty to the capability of what we call the rising middle class globally. And why do we care for that? Well, the reason we care for that as a supply chain professional and as a citizen of this planet Earth is that it created a discretionary spending beyond just the Western democracies and developed economy. We created a larger consumer base and opened up the market. And that led us to the prosperity, in some cases disproportionately, to the Asia and Latin America, more so than what the mature economy had participated. But one has to understand that globalization has fueled the growth, opened up the new markets, and created a large segment of population that has fueled the very interconnected society of global supply chain management. So if we look at it from the decoupling standpoint, albeit it's difficult, deglobalization would be even monstrous in terms of the consequences of shrinking everything back to the home base for countries would lead to a dramatic fallback in terms of the economic prosperity across the globe. And therefore, I believe the decoupling will be a much better and much more feasible solution. So deglobalization is simply, because what I just said, is not going to be feasible. The mature Western democratic system has to have an access to the market outside of their home base. Because if you think about the demographics in Europe and in Americas, it's aging populations. Our consumption rate, albeit it's a large dollars spent, but in terms of the future growth is not as high as what we see in emerging markets. And we want to participate in those markets equally and continue to trade, but then not be exposed the way we are with this pandemic or any other geopolitical or natural disaster. So the decoupling makes sense. Building the supply chain resiliency makes sense. Building the network that is not one country specific or one country centric makes complete sense. So decoupling solves a heavy reliance on China, right? Without marginalizing China. And here's I want to underlining this, that we have a lot of appetite to sort of have this anti-Chinese or anti-China rather conversation. And I think we need to find a way to decouple without marginalizing China. Because that's the key, is the 1.3 billion population, of which almost close to 400 million are enjoying the middle class lifestyles, consuming the Apple phones and Teslas and Boeing airplanes and many other things that we create at a high service value proposition. We want that market segment to be part of it. And then last but not the least, why decoupling makes sense and not deglobalization, there's already legacy in place that provides a blueprint for decoupled supply chain networks. We do that in aerospace. We do this in some of the pharmaceutical, or we do this in a very IP intense product segmentation. We manage this decoupled supply chain network and have a very robust resiliency built into those supply chains. So for all of those reasons, decoupling makes sense. The C-suite, the leadership has to look at it, the ways to do it, and not only just moving away from the manufacturing from China to Southeast Asia or Latin America or in Africa for that matter, but it's truly to decouple, to make sure those nodes are not interconnected within the same continents and region, and designing it as such. So simply, the chart says it all. The largest value of global exports across borders, across region, across continents has happened. That has fueled the world as we see today. We're interconnected from moving goods, services, and people in the most efficient ways. And we tend to forget what this prosperity cycle across the globe has created a lot of positives for us. But I also want to undermine that I'm very cognizant, and we should talk about some of the negatives, right? We have sacrificed some of the sustainability related issues, environmental policies and procedures, some of the regulatory compliance policies and procedures. So yes, this globalization has underpinned some of the basic structural things that we should have taken care of it, but we didn't. But those can be addressed as a part of the overall scheme of being globalized while we decouple and address those things much more frugally, much more gracefully, and create a new formula for the total cost of ownership, moving away from strictly the cheapest, the lowest, and without regards to any other variable, to much more holistic, much more balanced, much more customer-centric, but also taking care of our environment, regulatory compliances, and so forth. So we can continue to see this, that why it makes sense. On the second point is that if we were to go back, getting rid of our reliance on each other in a society that we now have become, and a generation we have raised with such an interconnected world, that it may have a long-term implication. It may actually puts China in a position to take the world leadership role. Because by us retracting back in a deglobalized way, or Europe becoming deglobalized, simply does not mean the world, the rest of the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa continent, will go back and retract the way we would. So it makes absolutely no sense, right? Is to think about the population density between India and China represents close to 3 billion. And then you look at the growth, projected growth by 2030, 2050, the markets are in emerging areas. So we have to look at it. How do we play in sort of win-win mindset and not revert to an emotional decision of looking at the past and what we did in the past to sort of deglobalize. And then the last but not the least, since 1982, if you recall the Honda plant in Marysville, they opened up in Ohio, set the transition that it is a great idea for us to bring the manufacturing based close to where the customer demand is. So it almost became the Japanese automobile, Toyota's, Honda, Nissan, Mitsubishi. They all realized that, hey, it makes sense for us to create the manufacturing close to where the demand is. And if we can use that blueprint for the rest of the commodities, rest of our industry, that sets the tone of a decoupled supply chain. So being independent for each node, but interconnected by still being dependent, so that your contingencies and mitigation strategy does not need to look at the end-to-end, but rather in a smaller segments of your supply chain. In many cases, just the raw material movements and some sub-assembly that you would move, which what we do between US and Mexico, US, Mexico, Canada, part of our USMCA, we do that very well. So that what I call a decoupled sample and a blueprint of the supply chain nodes. But let's become realistic. As I'm supporting my hypothesis of decoupling, I'm very cognizant that decoupling will not be easy. It will not be cheap for sure, which is what we're used to. Decoupling of supply chain is basically the only way out to make sure that we don't repeat what happened with COVID-19. The agility, the resiliency of supply chain network is no longer going to be sort of an afterthought. It will actually required for every company to be able to have their plan in place, execution in place, because the shareholder, the board, the society, the government will not allow this to happen again. Imagine as a humanity, we've pumped in over $6 trillion of bailout just to keep the momentum to not have a larger impact than what the COVID exposed us. So if you think about it from the total cost of disaster, take those $6 trillion, and if you had done that into the total cost of ownership in an aggregate way, we could have had much better decoupled supply chain. That would have paid attention to a lot of other things than just the cheapest manufacturing cost for many decades. And I think that's going to be the precedence going forward. So what does this mean for the future of supply chain? So in a perfect future, what I envision is a supply chain network. Once again, will be very customer-centric, built in a very heavily digitized platform, interconnected through decoupling, but interlinked between the regions, customer nodes, and continent. The big thing of post-COVID supply chain is that this catalyst of COVID-19 is going to accelerate the adaptation of digital technologies such as AI, ML, blockchain, IoTs, RPAs, advanced data analytics capabilities. Is no longer going to be a buzzwords. It's going to be the necessity, part of our DNA, because the networks of the future will be efficient, effective, resilient, and eco-friendly. Not one of those four, but all at the same time. And the only way you can really achieve this is truly by taking advantage of our capabilities that we today have, being efficient while being effective, being resilient, but also taking care of some of the major disaster of last 30 years of doing, which is looking at the eco-friendly component as well. So I want to reflect this before I hand over to Melody and leave some time for Q&A. But I want you to think about the post-COVID world. If we think that the COVID-19 really created this disruption, I want you to think deeper and understand the disruption was not caused by the COVID. It's not the impact of what COVID would have done. It is how we, over the last 30 years, truly put all our eggs into one basket. We truly, as a supply chain professionals, as executives of the company, we really went after the growth, top line, as well as bottom line, with zero consideration of the pandemic, natural disaster of a magnificent size, and geopolitical tension, such as what US and China trade was exposed to. So hopefully the future of supply chain, the perfect future, which is a decoupled, properly executed, properly thought through, and we still become the global citizens, appreciate the diversity, appreciate what we can bring best for each other, and truly be part of the much better future as a society. Melody, back to you.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was awesome teaching. Due to the time that we have left here, I want to be able to tackle all the questions that came in. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of overview of NexInfo. If you can change the slide here for me, Nick. So who we are, just want to make sure that you know that we are not just a fly-by-night kind of company. We're very recognized in the industry here as a premier partner of Oracle and many other ERP systems. What makes us unique and high level is we blend business processes and software consulting services. Our main domain, you can see here, the ERP, PLM, product lifecycle management, integrated business planning, CRM, and as you can see, many others. We are also recognized here by many different sales organizations, and I just want to emphasize the last one that we got, which is the CIO Review 10 Most Promising ERP Consulting Services in 2019. We are based here in Orange County, but have offices all across the U.S. and Europe and India. If you want to learn a little bit more about us, just go to our website, nexinfo.com, or you can get connected with me and I can give you much more information about us. So just so we can get right on the Q&A here, Nick, I'm going to start with the first question. Sorry, there's another slide here. As you can see, our industry experience is all across the board. So we have a few questions here, Nick. So let me just start with one because of the time. I want to make sure you'll be able to address all these questions. First question, Nick. Should we have a different strategies for countries where the industry is completely controlled by the government?
That's a great question. So I think one of the biggest variable that we really should focus on it is the role of the government. What I consider that to be what a soft infrastructure. A lot of time the network, supply chain network models, we emphasize the hard infrastructure, which is infrastructures, road, rail, bridge, utilities, electricity, internet connectivity. Those are very tangible, and we often don't pay attention equally to the soft infrastructure, the regulatory compliance, and government stabilities and transparencies and so forth. I think what this COVID has exposed us, and part of the decoupling of supply chain, will demand that the transparency is as good, if not better, than having a highways on the roads. Because of one, yes, you do not feel the bumps and everyday truck movements from point A to B, but if you don't have a transparent government and governance models, you will feel the bumps without feeling physical, literally the bumps on the road by working with those government models where the governance is not properly executed and it's not transparent. So to answer the question, absolutely, the soft infrastructure, the role of the government, and then the transparency should be viewed equally to the physical infrastructure.
Thanks, Nick. Let's move on to the next question here. What is happening with the food supply chain during the COVID-19 crisis?
So, in my view, I think the problem that we have seen both in healthcare supply chain and into the food supply chain is not because we had a crisis in both of those industries. I think the reason we got caught and flat-footed is simply because we did not execute the true knowledge and capabilities we have in terms of addressing these things from the supply chain standpoint. We knew the shortages of PPE going to impact our ability to take care of our healthcare supply chain. But we also knew at the same time that a lot of our food supply chain, the middle part of the supply chain in the food industry, especially in the protein, meat industry, pork, chicken, beef, you have processing plants from from cattle once they go to the sort of a butchering process to final end product coming out of it was all people-driven processes, and we did not foresee and didn't have foresight to really address that issues in terms of creating the safety protocols, bringing that measure of confidence in the workforce, and keeping our food supply chain safe. And therefore, when you disrupt the middle part of the supply chain, it impacts the front, where we now saw that a lot of the piglets were euthanized, milk's being poured, and subsequently we also impacted the back end of the supply chain. So I'm certainly hoping that we will really sort of address these issues in both the healthcare and food supply chain. And the big lesson learned would be that in many events of this degree, the centralized execution, planning, and putting resources at the central level, and then dispatching knowledge based on the resources at the state, county, and city would be the best way to handle it.
Thanks, Nick. Let's move on to the next question here. Do you believe that technology in the global supply chain is most important than ever? Also, do you believe that since a lot of companies have adapted technology to the COVID-19 crisis, that companies are going to stick with technology?
I believe the technology in supply chain, what I call that as a digitization of supply chain, is no longer going to be an option. The companies that will survive through the post-COVID into the 2025 will be much better equipped with integrating digital practices, much better uh, at adopting all the potential opportunities within the digital supply chains, and they will be the leaders. And not only they will be the leaders, but they'll also be disproportionately rewarded with a larger market share than those that they're taking sort of an ad hoc approach or not participating in digital. So technology transfer, technology adaptation, and digitization is what's going to be the future norm, and only way the decoupling will be successful.
Perfect. Next question. We have a few here. Sorry, Nick. Should the U.S. government also decouple the essential versus the non-essential supply chains, or will the impact supply chain resilience?
Absolutely. So this is not only just the US, but I think you'll see this as a global practice that some essential commodities will be regulated by the government policies and the governance guidance to be completely decoupled and and managed somewhat regionally, if not locally. So that is absolutely going to happen. The conversation already has begun, and it's likely to accelerate as we come out of this COVID-19 crisis.
All right. We have a few more minutes here. Next question. How China will react if decoupling happens?
Well, I think if we do this decoupling without making it as a China centric issue, I think we can really be fruitful in being able to decouple successfully and still have China continue to be a major trading partner. I think it's truly how we view the decoupling and engage China in that conversation. But China understands. China was already decoupling itself. So if you think about the last 5 years, China really became less dependent on their manufacturing capabilities, especially the cheap manufacturing capabilities, and more into the digital frontiers and service-based model. So China was already leaning towards that. China was already anticipating them not becoming too dependent on the manufacturing base. China has already divested their own manufacturing supply chain nodes to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, and many other places. So this has already begun with China. I think how gracefully we do and how continue to dialogue and engage and not make this as a power position, but rather somewhat supply chain network redesign conversations with sort of a win-win in mindset. It can be then neutralized.
All right. Still have some time here. Next question. What do you think is the role of blockchain in ensuring secure supply?
So I think one of the things the COVID-19 really exposed us is that we were so under-equipped with our capabilities to authenticate the suppliers, manufacturers across the world. A lot of healthcare providers that I've spoken to, they were taken on a ride for simply, excuse me, for simply not knowing where the source is, authenticating the commodities that they were being charged, in many cases 50% upfront. I think the blockchain, proper implementation and maturity of the blockchain, let's say 3-5 years that we would have, if we were in a position to have that today, we could have avoided a lot of these issues that we dealt with it, trying to mitigate the COVID-19 supply chain disaster. So in my view, I think blockchain can really help, especially if we decouple the supply chain in a much more confined regional supply chain nodes. It can provide solid capabilities to connect our supply chain nodes and authenticate a lot of the validations that we today do through either intermediary, brokers, or through banks.
Okay. Next question here. As decoupling takes place with technology and playing a role in it, Do you see companies working together to make this happen amongst each other, or more so in a silo effect?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the corporations, both for-profit and non-profit, tends to work independently in a silo, simply because they don't want to create the large consortiums where the data, their proprietary information. So unfortunately, I think the decoupling will happen at a different rate by different company, but also by different segment. Pharmaceutical, uh, aerospace, likely to actually move much faster than consumer goods and your staple commodities, for example. So my belief is that I would lean towards that this will be done much more uh, in a smaller groups of individual companies and executing independently rather than in a larger consortium base.
Great. Not sure if you've answered this, probably similar to another question, but where do you begin and how to begin the digitization of supply chain? What does it take to digitize the supply chain?
Oh, wow. So this could be the whole another hour that I can talk about it. Uh,
You got
so
5 minutes.
so there is no simple answer, honestly. But the quick way to start, truly, is to understand what your current state of supply chain is, and then understand what is the digital future state should and can look like, and how big is that gap, and are those gap too big for you to really bridge over, or can you find partners? Can you find capabilities through other means? And what would that look like? And are you willing to commit capital resources, uh, obviously financial resources, and then also the leadership resources to be able to uh, design, conceptualize, design, and execute, right? And this simply going from what even NexInfo rather, was talking about, going into sort of a cloud-based technology and data analytics to simply deploying a lot of the capabilities of RPAs and AI/ML or even blockchain. So you don't need to be really the first to market, but also you don't want to be the last to the market.
All right. Let's pause for just a couple of minutes here. It's close to our hour. Let's give the audience a minute or two if there's any other questions they want to post, and then we will conclude our session. One just came in here. How do you see decoupling impacting consumer good retailers who source internationally?
So I've been on this soapbox for over 2 years, in which I forecasted almost 50% of the retailers would disappear by 2030. I've accelerated the timeline now to 2025. I think we already seen quite a few just in the last 2 weeks filing bankruptcies. The retail model, as it stands, brick and mortars, the legacy players, they're just simply stuck in the past. They are stuck in what they know the best and what they should know living in the future. And unfortunately, they're not agile enough to transition from the current practices to the future state practices. And the competition, the best in class for in their segmentation, are just destroying them up and down the street because they're transforming, they're moving rapidly, they're capturing the market share. And unfortunately, the rate of disruption in the retails is going to accelerate post-COVID.
Thank you, Nick. I think that would be it for all the Q&A, and I will conclude this session today. Once again, thank you so much, Nick, for a very well presented topic of the globalization and decoupling. And I hope we served all the audience well for this session. And if you have any follow-up questions or any follow-up information you need, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can email let's talk at nexinfo.com, or you can give us a call. Once again, thank you so much, everybody, for participating and being with us today. Be safe, stay home. Thank you so much. Bye bye now.